Hello all. So today we're talking about governance and regulation of participation in Olympic sport. The purpose of the Olympic movement is to contribute to world peace by educating youth through sport and by developing mutual understanding and a spirit of friendship and fair play. The Olympic movement is also a moneymaker, generating more than $5.45 billion for broadcast rights, ticket sales, official sponsorships, and other marketing and licensing efforts during the 2005 and 2008 quadrennium. In the 2009 and 2012 quadrennium, broadcast revenue alone totaled $3.9 billion, and the Olympic program sponsors generated $957 million. Governance of such a large and ongoing international undertaking is understandably complex. This chapter examines the legal structure and relationships of the many governing bodies that participate in the Olympic movement. It also discusses the impact of the Amateur Sports Act of 1978 and the Ted Stevens Olympic and Amateur Sports Act of 1998 on Olympic governance within the United States. Finally, it looks at the authority of Olympic governing bodies to regulate events and participants. So in looking at management context and relevant laws and cases in the Olympic movement, of course we have the Amateur Sports Act and a few others, as you can see, though, looking at the WADA code and IF rules and IOC rules. So quite a bit to discuss today. So the purposes of the Olympic movement, really, it was to contribute to world peace and educate youth through sport, develop mutual understanding and a spirit of friendship and fair play. The Olympic movement started many years ago, and with that, it was about people being able to travel through countries, and so with that, of course, there had to be world peace that went on as well. And it's also about making money. Broadcast rights are, like we said, a multi-billionaire, billions of dollars in broadcast rights. So revenue generating, ticket sales, sponsorships, and other marketing and licensing. There are major governing bodies of for the Olympic sports, and it is quite complex with several layers of governing bodies involved, some national and some international, as well as multiple governing bodies within each governance layers. So you've got your International Olympic Committee, and just memorize these letters so that you don't have to keep coming back to this. So International Olympic Committee is IOC, National Olympic Committees, so you can have many different National Olympic Committees, the NOCs. You also have the International Olympic Federations and the national governing bodies. These all do different things, and like they said, it does overlap. So national governing bodies, NGBS, and organizing committees for the Olympic Games, or OCOGs. Now, the organizational chart for Olympic governing bodies, you can see this is kind of where there's a lot of crossover between the committees and governing bodies. We're going to talk a little bit about all of this. So, but this is a good slide to remember and to go back to when you have questions. So, with the International Olympic Committee, it is a non-governmental, non-profit organization composed of individuals and organizations who agree to abide by the IOC's Olympic Charter, which codifies the bylaws and regulations of the IOC. It does have an overarching control, meaning it kind of oversees all of those governing agencies. There is a maximum of 115 members which serve an 8-year term, which is a fairly good long time. They're in there so that they can see changes and make changes, but not too long. As far as administrative affairs, they are overseen by a 15-member executive board and the IOC president. The IOC does have exclusive ownership rights to the organization, the marketing, reproduction, and broadcasting of the Olympic Games. They do seek other resources needed to fulfill its mission. Its regulatory decisions are final. However, the IOC has agreed to submit disputed decisions for a final arbitration to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is an international arbitral court originally created by the IOC. Now, there are other governing bodies, and basically that consists of 204 National Olympic Committees, or NCOs, 35 international federations, 47 national governing bodies in the United States, and as many as 4 different organizing committee for the Olympic Games, maybe operating at any one time for different Olympic Games. So you've got your winter, your summer games, and they're working simultaneously but on different things. Now, the Olympic movement partners, one of those is the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA. It is an independent agency created to implement a universal anti-doping policy that defines banned substances, drug testing procedures, and penalties in order to harmonize the policies of the various IFs. The Court of Arbitration for Sport is involved in resolving legal disputes in international sport through arbitration or mediation, using procedures adapted specifically to the needs of the international sport context. You can also check out their decisions on their website, on their WADA website. There have been 374 requests for arbitration, or there were, in 2012. Now, as far as dispute resolution processes of the CAS, or Court of Arbitration for Sport, typically there's an ordinary arbitration for legal disputes such as sponsorship contract dispute, appeals, arbitration for appeals from IFs, as well as consultation for advisory opinions on legal issues and mediation. Parties may be represented by legal counsel and may choose who will hear their case from a pool of CAS arbitrators. These parties may choose to agree on the rules of law to be applied by the CAS in their case. As far as competitive advantages, strategies related to governing bodies, important that you know that you investigate and understand the interrelationships among the governing bodies and their regulations, and watch for inadvertently disregarding important regulations due to your organization's relationship with another governing body. So just know how they overlap and what they do. As far as the Amateur Sports Act of 1978, it was enacted to revise the U.S. Olympic Committee's charter in 1950 in order to eliminate power struggles between American amateur sport governing bodies. The act vested the USOC with exclusive jurisdiction over participation and representation of the U.S. in the Olympic Games. It gave the USOC exclusive jurisdiction over U.S. participation and representation. It was amended in 1998 and is now called the Ted Stevens Olympic and Amateur Sports Act, or OASA. Now, as far as court intervention in Olympic governing decision-making, the USOC has granted each national governing board the exclusive right to determine athlete eligibility to participate in Olympic competition. Section 374 of the Amateur Sports Act grants authority to the USOC to resolve disputes involving the NGBs, or national governing boards, amateur athletes, and amateur sports organizations, with the purpose of protecting the opportunities for students, coaches, and other relevant individuals to participate in amateur athletics. The Supreme Court rules that the fact that Congress granted the USOC its corporate charter did not transform it into a state actor, which is a government entity or an entity that, due to action or entwinement with government, may be said to act with the authority of the government. State action is a prerequisite to establishing the constitutional protection of individual rights has been violated because the Bill of Rights protects citizens from government abuse, not mistreatment of private actors. Thus, constitutional protections of individual rights, such as freedom of expression, are not applicable to the USOC. If an athlete is unhappy with the USOC's resolution, the Amateur Sports Act provides the dispute may be submitted to the American Arbitration Association, or AAA, for binding arbitration. Courts are reluctant to intervene in these cases, but they will review them when other remedies have been exhausted. And they are willing to rule on whether USOC or a national governing board has followed its own rules and whether it has provided appropriate due process and the case was not arbitrary or capricious. As far as regulation of events, who decides what? The authority to regulate the Olympic Games and its events varies by type of governing body. Under the Olympic Charter, the IOC Executive Board retains the authority to decide which sports and specific events are included on the menu of events for the Summer and Winter Olympic Games. The number of potential competitors, spectator interest, and potential for revenue generation is deciding whether to drop an existing sport or support a new sport, such as snowboarding, which was added to attract younger viewers and promote higher TV ratings and increase sponsorship revenue that this target market brings. Sometimes politics is an important factor in determining the program events, such as 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics, the ski jumping, as well as women's bobsledding was added in 1998 to encourage more women to participate. The inclusion of events has rarely faced legal challenge, whereas with exclusion of events, that has led to some lawsuits. And their argument is really discrimination based upon gender and inequity. Now, the organizing committee of the Olympic Games, or OCOG, are charged with preventing political demonstrations at the Games, and therefore they decide what countries can compete. Now, with reforms to the host city selection process, a country's National Olympic Committee, or NOC, determines who competes, individual, competitor, or team. The NOCs are responsible for conducting a selection process in their own country for cities that wish to bid to host the Olympic Games. They then nominate the winner to the executive board of the IOC to be considered for official candidacy to become the host city. The executive board conducts a candidature acceptance procedure to determine which cities will become official candidates. These cities then submit a candidature field to an evaluation commission composed of representatives from IFs and NOCs, IOC members, representatives of the International Olympic Committee for Athletes Commission and the International Paralympic Committee, and other experts. The executive board compiles a final slate of candidates for an election held during the appropriate IOC session. The host city election is typically held 7 years prior to the Games. The IOC makes the ultimate decision for the host city selection process. And there is prohibition of visits by IOC members to candidate cities. It also decides on who has media access to those IOC session meetings and whether there's mandatory publication of sources of revenue and expenditures. As far as use of social media, sponsorship, advertising, and social media, the IOC and NOCs, Rule 7 of the Olympic Charter provides that the IOC has exclusive ownership of all rights to the symbols of the Olympic Games, so the rings. Although it permits the NOC to use and license Olympic trademarks for nonprofit Olympic fundraising and related activities. The NOCs are also charged with protecting against the unauthorized use of Olympic trademarks. The USOC retains the exclusive right to control the commercial use and licensing of the Olympic trademarks in the United States. The IOC established official guidelines regarding the use of social media by athletes and accredited journalists. The IOC bans video and audio journalistic coverage from being placed on social media. It does, however, actively encourage and support athletes and other accredited persons at the Olympic Games to take part in social media and to post, blog, and tweet their experiences. The IOC's official position is that it actively encourages and supports athletes and other accredited persons at the Olympic Games to take part in social media and to post, blog, and tweet their experiences. I think I just repeated that. However, it does not allow posting of photos or videos to their social media website. So they retain permission to block other people from posting to their social media sites. As far as security measures, the national organizing committees create the organizing committees of the Olympic Games, which are responsible for the preparations for and conduct of the Games, including the security measures. The IOC evaluates the overall emergency response and security plans to ensure that acceptable standards have been met. The NOC and OCOG determine the specific security procedures regarding access to venues, security of the Olympic Village, searches for weapons and other unauthorized possessions, and so forth. At the 2002 Salt Lake City Winter Olympic Games, facial recognition video technology and screening spectators' images against databases of known criminals and terrorists was installed in the ice arena. Video surveillance by unmanned aerial vehicles such as drones have been used at international sports mega events since 2012 Olympic Games in London and 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi. Drone surveillance is more invasive than surveillance by fixed cameras, as they are used from a height at which spectators are unaware they are under surveillance, which is a violation of the Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable searches. Involvement of police, military, city, and governmental officials might serve to establish that OCOG as a state actor in its function of providing security measures. So, is the combination of highly invasive surveillance technology and information gathering functions to search sports spectators on a suspicionless basis an illegal search under the Fourth Amendment? What's your opinion? So, competitive advantage strategies for contracting with governing bodies. If you work for a company that has a contract with an NOC or NGB, find out how laws and the interrelationships among governing bodies may affect business decisions. If you work in social media marketing, be aware of the prohibition of unauthorized use of Olympic marks and the name Olympics, and do not post photos or videos of the games. As far as regulation of the participants, and regulating events, Olympic sport governing bodies possess varying degrees of authority to regulate the behavior of participants, including athletes, coaches, and officials. With disputed competition outcomes, the Olympic Charter grants to the IFs the authority to regulate the competition of their sports worldwide, including regulating the fairness of the competition. Olympic judges and officials are approved by the IFs, and the IFs have the authority to suspend them for violating rules or ethical codes of conduct. Amateurism. The principle of amateurism has been embedded in the Olympic movement since the beginning, but the line has become increasingly blurred. In 1974, they deleted the word amateurism from the Olympic Charter. It was not implemented until 1986. The IOC still retains authority to regulate the economically motivated conduct of participants during the Games. Drug testing. The IFs have the authority to promulgate anti-doping and drug testing rules, which are then investigated and enforced by the respective national governing boards. Sex testing. To enforce the competitors in events that are in fact the gender they are said to be, they began conducting sex tests in 1968 in the Grenoble Winter Games and the Mexico City Summer Games. Sex reassignment operations have become more frequent, and concerns about discrimination against transsexual individuals have increasingly been voiced. Gender verification tests were endorsed by the IOC in the 2000 Sydney Games. It requires a confidential case-by-case evaluation to determine whether the eligibility requirements have been met. It grants to the medical delegate of the relevant sport governing body the authority to take all appropriate measures to determine the sex of a competitor once it has been questioned. As far as general competition rules, the IFs determine the general rules for competition for the particular sports worldwide. These rules include rules defining how the sport is to be played, scoring methods to be used, criteria for disqualification, and the specifications for legal equipment. Oscar Pistorius, elite South African sprinter who runs with the aid of prosthesis on both legs, sought to compete in international trace events against able-bodied competitors. And of course, you know now he was allowed to compete at that level. Now, he's had other trouble since then, but he was allowed to compete. And there actually was some discussion as to whether he had an advantage over, and that was really what they tested. And they tested it very thoroughly to determine whether he was at an advantage or disadvantage because of his prosthesis. And it actually was found he was at a disadvantage, but he went through pretty grueling testing to determine that. Disciplinary actions for rules violations. The national governing boards typically have the authority to impose disciplinary sanctions when international federation rules against misconduct have been violated. The CAS has demonstrated a willingness to overturn national governing boards and IF sanctions if they appear arbitrary or if the organization fails to follow its rules. As far as competitive advantage strategies with contracting with governing bodies, become familiar with your sport governing body rules for submitting protests and appeals. Familiarize yourself with the decision-making standards of the CAS and communicate to coaches the message that athletes can and will be punished for doping. Advise all staff about which governing bodies have the authority to regulate their conduct. The IOC no longer strictly adheres to the principle of amateurism, one of the principles of the Olympic movement since the beginning. In your opinion, does having professional athletes competing make the games better or worse? Now, as far as drug testing is concerned, there is, of course, a World Anti-Doping Code. I recommend that you check that out. That may be part of our discussion as well this week. And the United States Anti-Doping Agency is one, of course, that we use here in the United States. Now, any violations to that, and typically CAS is one who looks at that and tests it with strict liability, and they determine the sanctions for violations, whether it be disqualifications, warnings, fines, bans, or suspensions. You've actually seen that with Russia, where they have been banned from this summer's Olympics because of doping issues. And so it's been kind of interesting to watch the last few weeks. I don't know if y'all been watching it or not, but been pretty interesting. They will not be competing in this summer's Olympics. And some are excited about that. Some are a little upset about it, partly because they competed against the Russians previously and lost. And there was some question as to whether those individuals were doping at that time. So a lot of people were really disappointed. I don't know if it'll mean an overturn of those medals or not. I think this far out, I kind of think there's not hope of that, but kind of interesting in that respect. And so what are your thoughts on transsexual individuals participating in the Olympic Games? If an athlete has undergone sex reassignment surgery, should he or she compete under the new or original gender? And then what are your thoughts on a runner who is double amputee competing while wearing prosthetic devices? Now, of course, you have the Paralympics, and they can compete against others who are wearing prosthetic devices, but such as with Oscar Pistorius, where he's competing against able-bodied runners. So this concludes our discussion for today. I look forward to hearing from you in your discussion, and I'll talk with you soon.